A German soldier raised his Christmas tree and waddled to the center of the battlefield. But here's the strange thing. Instead of firing, the British and French troops climbed out of their trenches and cheered and applauded, attracted by the German Christmas carols. At the same time, the British suddenly played bagpipes to accompany the Germans in the center of the battlefield. At the end of the song, the German raised his Christmas tree above his head and boldly greeted the enemy. He said, "Good evening, Englishmen," to which he replied, "Good evening, Germans. We're not English, we're Scottish." It's hard to imagine that this was the battlefield of the First World War. At that moment, the German officer came up to the soldiers and ordered them to go back, because this is not an opera house, but a battlefield. He didn't want any of his soldiers to die on Christmas Eve. But before he could say a word, the British officer dropped his guard and approached the two men, the leaders of the two armies, who were supposed to be fighting each other, greeted each other. The French officer was unable to sit still. He took off his rifle and walked out of the trench. Then he greeted the German officer in the same way as the British officer. The British officer said, "I propose an armistice tonight. What do you think? One less battle won't hurt. And it's Christmas Eve." The German officer says, "Don't worry, it's just for tonight." And so, the three officers agreed to a one-night truce on Christmas Eve. As a gesture of goodwill, the three officers raised a toast to celebrate the short-lived peace. At that moment, several flares suddenly went up, lighting up the battlefield like fireworks. All the soldiers cheered and applauded. With the British, French and German soldiers climbed out of the trenches and gathered in the center of the battlefield. They were still wary of each other, until one of the Germans took out the chocolate, signaling the exchange of wine. The tension was eased. The other soldiers dropped their defenses and exchanged food and wine. It was as if they were no longer enemies, but old friends who hadn't seen each other for years, drinking and chatting about everything. Soon the clock struck midnight. The soldiers of the three countries had to return to their own trenches. Before saying goodbye, all the soldiers kept looking back, as if telling each other with their eyes, "If there hadn't been a war, we might have been good friends." Early the next morning, the Germans were awakened by the sound of digging. When they looked around, they saw a British soldier digging a hole, but just as they thought he was laying a mine, a British medic suddenly came running out holding up a white flag.